describing some recent results on channel function large model detection. This is part of my PhD thesis work under the supervision of Professor Mohammed Nasr and Professor Ali Shihab. So first, as a motivation and building on a talk yesterday by Professor Dawi about the future of wireless and the use cases and what we are able to achieve with the next fifth generation of wireless communication that promise to connect even devices with each other and the famous tactile internet notion. But what I'm interested more here is in terms of numbers, how do we translate these use cases into numbers of 5G? So 1,000 times more data volumes are expected, 100 times more connected devices, and 100 times more expected data rates. But most important thing here is that all that should be achieved while at the same time reducing the power consumption by 10 times. And at the core of that, to achieve that, is small signal processing techniques. And one of the techniques or technologies enabled 5G is multiple-input, multiple-output technology. It consists of deploying multiple antennas on both transmitter and receiver sides. Traditionally, it was point-to-point, but then paradigm shifts introduced multi-user MIMO and later on large and massive MIMO systems. Usually, the target was to increase the number of users that can be multiplexed, but later on, after achieving this target of multiplexing, the target was to work on the trade-off between complexity and performance. So here you can see a test bed for massive MIMO. Now with massive MIMO, we usually have hundreds or more antennas, but only at the base station or transmitter side. At the receiver side, usually end up only simple user antenna, simple user with one antenna or two antennas. Now massive MIMO allows fine-grained beamforming, allows an order of magnitude increase in capacity. And very interesting thing is that it allows something called lateral propagation. So even with massive magnitudes, we still can achieve near optimal performance with simple linear processing. Now on the other side, there is something that is called large MIMO. Now massive MIMO is understood to be the key enabling technology for 5G, but large MIMO would also be used in 5G, typically in the backhaul or connection between two base stations. Large MIMO consists of large number of antennas on both transmitter and receiving sides. However, unlike with massive MIMO, because of this inherent symmetry in it, we end up, if we want to achieve near optimal performance, we need an exponential complexity in detection schemes. Historically, since decades ago, and since we started to work on detection schemes for MIMO, there were like the least optimal linear detectors, and then we have the maximum likely or most optimal detectors. In between, many such as field recorder and their variants, many detectors that trade complexity with performance exist. Mainly I'm interested here with what's called layer orthogonal latch detector, because building on this detector, we propose several detectors in our work. Now, for massive MIMO, as I previously said, that linear detectors or linear processing schemes are sufficient even at very large dimensions. However, for large MIMO systems, this is not facilitated. So usually search-based schemes are applied, such as detection-based in local searches, and these are heuristics algorithms. We also have message passing algorithms and vertical models to mitigate this detection performance or latch reduction as well. In our work, we're proposing a new family of detectors that's called channel function detectors. Now, first of all, I will start with the traditional system models. So we have H representing the channel matrix, X being the transmitted symbols, and Y the received symbols. A very popular family of detectors built on QR decomposition. So after decomposing H into an upper triangular matrix R and a unitary matrix Q, we can have a modified system model. That is Rx plus the noise instead of Hx plus noise. Now, if we exploit the upper triangular nature of R, we can end up with this significant reductions in complexity. However, we will take one step further, and instead of R, we will introduce what's called a function of the triangular matrix. So our modified system model aims at the following. Instead of multiplying by Q Hermitian, we multiply by W Hermitian. Now, W Hermitian is not like Q Hermitian being unitary, so we will end up with the following. First, to multiply by Q Hermitian, if the distance matrix are maintained. If we multiply by W, we have a different distance matrix. So eventually we'll have to pay a price. Now this price that we pay in performance is insignificant compared to what we can get in reduction in complexity. For example, first of all, consider the fully complete upper triangular matrix. So traditional schemes will start by detecting symbols at this layer and then successively substituting its value on upper layers and so on and so forth. However, if an error occurs on an earlier detection, it will propagate upwards. Now, what we are doing with puncture detection is that we aim at zeroing out these red entries here. So if we detect layers at the last layer here, while propagating upwards, we will only propagate a possible error on this layer only and not all other errors. But more importantly, in terms of reduction of complexity, every time we multiply this vector by another simple vector there, instead of multiplying the entire entries, only multiplying two entries. And think of it in terms of large dimensions of matrices. So this is basically the motivation of our work. So we looked at the family of detectors that use QRD. These are non-negative isolation detectors that also can be used in terms of security coding as QRD-based. Chase detector lower and S-lower, and we map them to a function version of these. So we have function non-cancellation, function and function chase detector. And the alternative for lower in the function setting is subspace detector. So here, this architectural design illustrates the proposed schemes. First of all, we look at traditional detectors that are QRD based. At the very low level, we have the non-cancellation detector. This detector just successfully cancels the interference from layer to another. If you multiply it multiple times, in a more sophisticated algorithm that's called chase detector, we can mitigate the propagation errors and achieve better results. Now, again, if we employ chase detector multiple times, they can be used as building blocks for the lower detectors, and all of these are reference detectors for our that we are proposing counterparts for them. Now, building on these detectors, and if we add the puncturing channel instead of the regular upper triangular channel, we end by puncture monitoring cancellation being on the lower layer. And again, if we employ this multiple times, in the context of a puncture chase detector, which itself if employed multiple times, will form a simple subspace detector. Now, first of all, if we compare the mechanism here, we can notice that it's a significant reduction in complexity at this lowest layer, which is iterated multiple times. So eventually, in a large setting, for example, a 64 by 64 memory system, we can end up reducing the complexity by 70 or 80%. But also, most importantly, is that the processing schemes on different layers can run in parallel. So it's a parallelizable implementation, unlike the reference schemes that after each iteration, each layer eventually should be mapped up all together and processed to get a unified output. So our proposed algorithm promises two things. First being parallelizable, and the other is reduced complexity. However, up to this point, we were not expecting also gains in performance. Until we further investigated the results, we noted that, so here we show every two pairs of the same color are correspond to one detection schemes, first being unpunctured and the other being punctured. Every time we introduce puncturing, there is a gap in performance. However, it's in the form of a shift, but not a change in the slope of performance. So in terms of diversity, we call there's no less in diversity gain. Except for the ones in blue here, which is called symbol-based subspace detection. This approach not only results in reduction in complexity, but also a gain in performance. So first, I've showed the hard output failure rate performance, and in the other figures, I'm showing the soft output. Hard output in the sense that we are directly just obtaining the detected symbols. In the soft output, we add an extra mechanism to produce reliability information to further enhance the performance of the schemes. In the soft output settings, if you look at the red curve here, we can note that in all scenarios, it is almost the best performing, except for very large MIMO orders, where lower can outperform it, but taking into consideration that at 1.8 times 1.8, the reduction in complexity is 90%, the gap in performance is considered negligible. Again, we show that in the context of correlated channels, the performance enhancement is further enhanced. We don't see that always the SSC is the best performing scheme, and also that comes at much reduction in complexity. After generating these results, we intended to analyze them theoretically and derive post-quantum equations to prove these gains. So first, we derived the lower bounds on the capacity or achievable information rates for the proposed detector, and we next put them alongside the experimental results. And we showed that as the order of MIMO increases, there is the loss in complexity in the punctured schemes compared to the loss in the achievable rates in punctured compared to unpunctured schemes is in the form of a gap and not the loss in scope. And we derived the analysis, and the form of this exponent here is the slope of the curve, and the slope of the curves are the diversity gains. So we note that under puncturing, the Chase factor remains of diversity 2, which is the diversity order of the Chase factor itself, as well as subspace factor, it maintains the diversity M. And again, we note here that the denominator includes interference plus noise, and we note that interference is much reduced in the context of high order MIMO as well as high order modulation types. So in conclusion, what we have proposed in our work is that we propose examining MIMO detectors that we call punctured QRT in lieu of regular QRT. We had derived bounds of capacity, diversity gain, and bit error rate. We showed that diversity orders are maintained under puncturing, and we showed also that significant computational savings can be achieved. We argued that the proposed schemes are better candidates for large MIMO detection compared to reference detectors in the literature. And we showed that they are more specifically of interest in the context of large constellation size as well. As a typical example, we take that in the context of 16 by 16 MIMO, 256 we achieve 2.5 dB gains, as at the same time reducing 7% of the complexity. So this concludes my work. And in a more comprehensive way, I typically transactional communications.
Thank you, Yadi. All right, so we'll open the floor for questions for Hadi.
I think it was slide 12 or 13. You had one of the schemes performing well, so reducing complexity but performing better from an accuracy perspective. Is there a certain property to that scheme that allowed you to get that increase in performance? Or,
Yeah, sure.
and if so, why would you use that scheme over the other schemes or not? Why not just go and use that scheme instead of all the other schemes that reduce accuracy while reducing the
Yeah, sure. Now, first of all, we compare this scheme with its counterpart from a QRT-based scheme. So this scheme is more complex than other schemes. It's called subspace. Subspace is more complex than Chase and linear detectors. So when the resources allow us to work on this level of complexity, compared to its QRT counterpart, which is much less complex. So basically, because functioning keeps this all these schemes independent and only dependent on the last screen. So if we only treat this symbol at a time and we do multiple decompositions, this way we can achieve both reduction in complexity and performance. However, this requires multiple decomposition. So unless we are doing multiple decomposition in the QRT-based version, it does not make sense to use this one. But if the resource allows us to do that, of course, this is the unique scheme.
How did I, before we was consider black and some of you are not in the area. How would you say, what is the evolution of basically your signal factor? Can you explain intuitively why this works?
Okay.
And they might turn.
So the basic idea is that instead of wanting a full upper triangular matrix, which includes multiple entries that cause some propagation of errors, we want to look at a much simpler, much neater kind of matrix decomposition. However, to achieve this matrix decomposition, we will be multiplying by a factor that degrades the performance. So noise will be colored, will not be uncolored anymore. It will not multiply by anymore. But then the attribution is that all of these schemes are independent. Only this one is limited to depend on all the others, and this one has full diversity on it. So the intuition is that instead of doing one decomposition and then have to deal with the error propagation, why don't we want to do multiple decomposition? Each time only take the value from the so in this way, we are working comparatively sparser matrix, much less complex, and at the same time achieving the required gains. But then these were only just observations. We have to take another step and prove them analytically and in closed form equations.
And this is where the information theory part comes?
Yeah. The information theory is the analysis of the error rates and the capacity.
So you're not using information when you do this?
We are only using it marginally. So If you plot the curves, there's no loss in the slope of the curves. There's only some shifts, and you can deal with them up to a specific.
So these shifts are predictable.
Yeah, they're predicted in closed form, and the simulations prove that the ones are almost achieving the theoretical.
All right, thank you guys for your questions. We're going to have to move to the next presenter. If you guys have further questions, we'll have a coffee break soon. You guys can discuss it before. Our next presenter is Fea Ideas, and she'll be presenting a research titled Assessing the Effects of Auditory Vocal Distraction on Driving Performance and Physiological Measures Using a Driving Simulator. From the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department.
Good afternoon. My name is Rana Tarabai. I'm currently completing my master's in transportation engineering. I had a chance to work on a research project supervised by Dr. Maya Abuzay entitled Assessing the Effects of Auditory Vocal Distraction on Driving Performance and Physiological Measures using a driving simulator, and I'm happy to share it with you today. In this presentation, I will introduce the topic, describe the methods, present the main findings, and conclude the research. With more than 1 million people dying each year as a result of road accidents, data published by the World Health Organization posit road accidents as a leading cause of death globally and as the first cause of death among people aged between 15 and 29 years in 2012. The US DOT reports that more than 27,000 lives were lost on US roads in 2016. The statistical profile of Lebanon shows that road injuries are the third cause of death, constituting 4% of the total deaths in 2012. With these numbers, road safety remains a mega issue for transportation engineers. Distraction has been identified as a risky behavior and is associated with an increase in workload, such as conversing with passengers, responding to cell phone calls, in-vehicle systems, and recently using mobile apps with the widespread of smartphones. This research focuses on auditory vocal distraction and aims to test the effect of an increase in the driver cognitive workload on driving performance and physiological measures using a driving simulation experiment and physiological sensors. A secondary auditory vocal task designed to simulate auditory vocal distraction in specific is added to the primary driving task. Two main physiological measures were reported in the literature to increase under conditions of stress and high workload. The heart rate, which is measured by the electrocardiogram, and the skin conductance, which is related to the sweat activity and is measured by the skin conductance sensors. This research utilizes a driving simulation experiment and a secondary auditory vocal task by introducing driving contextual changes manifested by 3 road events frequently encountered in an urban context. This research differs from previous research work that has investigated the effect of an increase in the driver cognitive workload in absence of variation in the driving context. A high-fidelity driving simulator from Drive Safety is used to collect driving performance data. MEDAC System 3 instrumentation and sensors were used to collect physiological sensors. The electrocardiogram is used to collect the heart rate, and the skin conductance sensors are used to collect the skin conductance data. The primary driving task consists of 3 driving scenarios derived from the urban context. In the first event, pedestrians cross the road suddenly in front of the driver. In the second event, a truck initially moving ahead of the driver stops suddenly. In the third event, the driver encounters a signalized intersection. Initially set to the green indication, the traffic light turns yellow, then red, just before reaching the intersection. As for the secondary task, the NBAC task is used. It is developed by the MIT H Lab and consists of an auditory presentation of random numbers with the 3 levels of difficulty. At the 0 back level, the driver is required to repeat the number that is just said. At the 1 back level, the driver is required to repeat the number that is said 1 number before the number that is just said, so we can see 1 shift in the presented sequence. And in the at the 2 back level, the driver is required to repeat the number that is said 2 numbers before the number that is just said. And again, you can see 2 numbers shift in the presented sequence. To To summarize, scenario variables consist of the driving events, which are the pedestrians, the truck, and the traffic light situations, and they are randomly presented for a subject. And the secondary task levels, which are the 0 bag, the 1 bag, and the 2 bag levels, which are also randomly presented to a subject. In order to assess the effect of the auditory vocal task, two main phases were designed. The control phase, in which the driver encounters the three load events without being subjected to the secondary task, and the treatment phase, in which the driver encounters the three load events while being subjected to the unback task. The treatment phase is designed so that the driver encounters one load event at one particular level of the unback task. One possible driving course is presented over here. In this example, the subject first drives a baseline, followed by a treatment phase whereby the subject encounters the 1 bag level at the truck situation, then the 0 bag level at the traffic light situation, and the 2 bag level at the pedestrian situation. Followed by the control phase, the subject encounters subsequently the pedestrians, the truck, and the traffic lights event. The IRB approved protocol consists of a screening interview that assesses the eligibility of the subject to participate in this experiment, signing the consent form, the census placement, a training session on the secondary task and the driving simulator, and then the actual driving experiment takes place for around 12 minutes, depending on the driver's speed. 103 subjects were enrolled in this experiment, and those are from the AB students population. However, 23 of them were excluded for several reasons, such as overspeeding, dizziness, or withdrawal from the experiment. The final sample consisted of 80 students. Now, after describing the methods and the sample, let us move to the findings. A paired analysis comparing between the treatment and the control phases within each subject showed that there are statistically significant differences in terms of the driving performance measures and the physiological measures. Results show that the driver adopts a regulatory behavior at the operational level, manifested by a reduction in the driving performance measures, such as the speed and the pedal depression, in order to allow the performance of the secondary task while driving at the same time. As shown in this example box plot, a lower average speed is observed at the treatment phase. From a safety perspective, the regulatory behavior is considered as a risky behavior, since resources available to keep control of the driving task will deplete over time after excessive efforts, and subsequently any attempt on self-regulation will fail. As a result of the body's activation of resources, physiological measures increased at the treatment phase. As shown in this example box plot, a higher average heart rate is observed at the treatment phase. A between-subject comparison comparing between the levels of the unback task showed that there are no major statistically significant differences in terms of the driving performance measures and physiological measures between subjects across the three levels of the unback task. The non-significant differences in driving performance measures implies that the driver reacts independently of the level of the unback task while driving in response to the road events, as if the road event dominates the secondary task. Similar results were reported in Yeskoda et al. In 2015, where driving performance measures were not affected by the level of difficulty of the unback task. As for physiological measures, the non-significant differences could be attributed to the fact that the analysis was restricted to instantaneous events that might not reveal significant variations in the physiological measures between subjects across the three levels of the unback task. To summarize, this study tested the effect of an increase in the driver cognitive workload on driving performance and physiological measures. At the treatment phase, driving performance measures decreased while physiological measures increased. However, no prevailing effect of the difficulty level was found at the three encountered road situations. This study has a number of limitations. A driving simulation experiment might not replicate exactly real-life driving conditions. The findings of this research are specific to the population of young students, and self-selection bias might be introduced if the driving behavior of those who volunteered to participate in this experiment was different than that of the non-participants. Current steps of this research include quantifying the driver's stress and workload as a latent variable in a dynamic model. As an application, physiological measures could be integrated within the vehicle on the steering wheel, for example, as shown in this picture, in order to detect variations and alert the driver to potential risks, which might lead to an enhancement in road safety. Finally, I would like to acknowledge my advisor and the committee members for their help, comments, and insights on this research. There's so many people who have helped me to conduct this research, as well as all the students who volunteered in this experiment. An earlier version of this work was presented at the annual meeting of the Transportation Research Board, Washington, D.C. With that, I would like to thank you, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Just a question. The cognitive test, you put the numbers, you tell them the numbers, and then they will tell you the last number.
Yes, they will repeat. It's a sequence of random numbers, and the subject has to repeat the number that is just said. So, for example, at the 0 back level, if the audio message says 0, the subject needs to say 0. Then the audio message says 1, the subject needs to say 1.
One back, the one before.
Yes, so the first number will not be said.
So they need to deduct two numbers, or they need to recall the...
They need to recall. There is no mathematical operation. They just need to recall the number that is just said.
Is there any surprising finding in this, or everything is as predicted?
Basically, as I have mentioned, similar results were reported in this study that I have mentioned concerning the influence or the differences across the levels of the NBAC task, and also for the regulatory behavior, the studies who have used this task to test the increase in workload also found this regulatory behavior as well.
You mentioned something in the beginning that one of the main differences
Yes.
is that the previous studies used either one of these three challenges.
Yes.
People passing by, or a truck stopping, or a traffic light. I didn't see, maybe I missed it, the trial to see whether there is a difference in behavior according to people passing by, which is more dangerous than a truck than a traffic light.
Okay, let me just first highlight what's the difference between this research and the other studies who have that used the NBAC task. Studies that used the NBAC task did not include any road event by driving. For example, they assessed the driving behavior on highway without having any hazard that the driver has to encounter. While in this study, we introduced the 3 driving events, and we particularly assessed the driving performance measures and the physiological measures within the segment of interest at each of these events.
Wouldn't it make a difference if I see a person passing by versus seeing a truck stopping?
In this analysis, which was a static analysis, we fixed the variable which is related to the road events, and we just compared the behavior and the physiological measures according to each road situation. However, in the dynamic analysis that we are conducting, we introduced we kept the road event as a variable, and we also analyzed the effect of the secondary task. Results of this analysis showed that there are no statistically significant differences between the road events. Yes, particularly for the traffic light situation and the pedestrians.
Can you go back to the slide that showed the difference in the average?
Yes.
So there is a shift in the average, but it looks like the minimum is pretty much. It looks like, I don't know, these are real proportional.
Yes.
It looks like the shift in the minimum is also so that the number of let's say the area below the average on the red side is equivalent somehow to the area above the average on the blue side. So it looks like صحيح طلعت الضوء بس the people who are below the average are.
And
If you look at covariance combination, or
if we look at the median, which is in the middle, the median is the median.
this is the average of the median.
The median. This is the median average heart rate is higher, and we have the first quartile and the third quartile, which are presented over here. This is the most. So basically, if you look at the first quartile, it is higher at the treatment phase comparing to the control phase, and the third quartile is also higher at the treatment phase than the control phase, and the same applies to the median.
questions. Thank you, Lena. Our next presenter is Adnan Tamir. And the title of his presentation is Effective Simple Ergonomic Interventions in the OR to Operating Room on Nurses' Physical Health. And Adnan Tamir is a graduate student in the Industrial Engineering and Management Department.
Hello everyone. This research aims at investigating the benefits of simple ergonomic interventions in the OR on nurses' physical health. This presentation is going to follow the conventional flow of research all the way from introduction to conclusion, limitations, and future work. So the big question is, why nursing? Is nursing because this domain has been associated with the highest levels of risks and injuries exceeding construction and maintenance. This high level of injury and rates trace back to multiple factors, as the aging of the nursing population and being characterized with inadequate muscle strength. Also, the lack of adequate training for physically demanding tasks within the nursing profession is another reason for this increase in injury rates. Nurses are expected to perform their duties with dedication, care, because they're dealing with patients and with humans, and that fact augments their physical exhaustion in addition to their emotional exhaustion. In addition to all of that, nurses are required to memorize names, room numbers, in addition to dosages, and where small mistakes will be critical. That also increases their cognitive demands, which leads to additional levels of stress and leading to additional levels of stress and to muscle contraction. In literature, publications in the domain classify nursing tasks into 250 tasks, sorting them from the least demanding tasks as blood withdrawal to the most physically demanding tasks as bathing a patient. In this list, we can find 4 of the most physically demanding tasks as repositioning patients and moving them from wheelchairs to beds and from a bed to another bed. In this research, we are going to focus on pulling a patient from one bed to a stretcher. As some countries introduced knowledge policies in their hospitals, mechanical lifts were introduced to aid nurses in transferring patients from beds to stretchers. However, the usage of mechanical lifts did not diminish the physical loads on nursing. In addition to that, these mechanical lifts required extensive training and time, and nurses did not have enough space to operate this equipment. The multiple withdrawals with mechanical lifts opened the door to simple ergonomic interventions that are going to be named in this presentation and research as friction-reducing devices. These devices are simple and could replace the mechanical lift. In this research, we tackled 3 devices: the bed sheets, plastic bags, and sliding boards. Bed sheets are a conventional method. It's already there on the OR table used to transfer a patient from a bed to a stretcher. And I won't reveal a secret. I tell you that nurses benefit from the slippery effect of plastic bag to slip the patients from a bed to a stretcher, in addition to a plastic sliding board to ease and facilitate the interface between the 2 beds in the OR. Usually, patient lateral transfers takes place at the flat bed. In this research, we are proposing to perform patient lateral transferring tasks at a laterally tilted OR table up to 25 degrees Celsius. We assume that tilting the table is going to reduce the pulling forces that are the root cause behind nurses' injuries. Thus, the objective of this research is to examine the benefits of laterally tilting OR table on physical health and to compare the ability of friction-using devices in promoting safety. In this study, 32 EB students served as participants, and they were divided into two groups. 16 nursing students acted as nurses, and 16 students from other faculties acted as patients. All participants were males, and all of them passed physical readiness assessment. Experiment took place at AUB MC in the OR. It was IRB approved. In each experimental trial, each nurse laterally transferred the patient in 6 different methods, which are the combinations of 2 bed angles and 3 friction-reducing devices. And in each experimental trials, we were collecting electromyography data in addition to subjective ratings of perceived exertion for the overall technique and for localized discomfort at certain muscles, in addition to efficiency and time. Electromyography data was collected from LSS EMG device, and they are wearable sensors that are going to be located on 8 different muscles: the upper trapezius, neck region, posterior deltoids, shoulder region, latissimus dorsi, the mid back region, and the rectus spinae, the lower back region. The EMG data is going to be referred in this research and presentation as percentage of maximum voluntary contraction, which is an indicator of the possibility of being exposed to injuries. In addition to that, in each experimental trials, nurses and patients were asked to rate the overall perceived exertion of the whole technique. For example, rating the flat bed with a sliding board. On a 10-point scale, where 0 indicated that there was no exertion at all, and 10 indicated that this task was very difficult. In addition to that, in a similar manner, the body discomfort map allows rating of the task, but this time at localized areas. And we've chosen 4 different areas that are really related to pulling tasks in nurses. In addition to that, time was collected as an indicator of efficiency. Using SPS as two-way repeated measures in ANOVA, the main effect of tilting the bed showed that using tilted beds, EMG, which is the maximum voluntary contraction and the indicator of being exposed to injuries, significantly decreased at the right and left upper trapezius and significantly decreased at the right and left rectus spine. In addition to that, using sliding boards significantly decreases muscle activation at all muscle sites in comparison to blankets, which is the conventional method. The blanket is also the atrocious. And investigating the OR bed angle effect on subjective ratings, which are the board scale and the body discomfort map, it showed that tilting the bed significantly decreases the board rates at all muscle sites and for the overall perceived exertion. And in a similar manner, using the sliding board significantly decreases the ratings in comparison to the blanket. However, as for time, the tilting operation significantly consumes more time than flat beds, and it doubles the time from 6.5 seconds up to 13 seconds. And there was no difference between plastic bag and sliding board at a level of 12 seconds for each experimental trial, and both of the devices were significantly greater than the blanket itself. In conclusion, we could say that the most commonly used draw sheet or blanket is the poorest at the level of aiding and assisting nurses. Experimental tasks that were used, that were associated with the usage of sliding boards, were rated as the least demanding tasks at the level of perceived exertion and at the level of electromyography data and percentage of maximum voluntary contraction. Using tilted beds decreased electromyography at the level of the shoulders, at the level of the neck and the lower back, but only when combined with sliding boards, it significantly decreases the possibility of injuries at the level of posterior deltoids and shoulders. This study was limited to young males from the nursing school. Future work or future studies could consider a wider age of people, of participants. Participants didn't have training on friction-using devices and patient-lateral transferring techniques. The study could show how being familiar with those devices and those techniques could lead to variation in the data. In addition to that, future work might also consider the differences among the different weights of patients and using broader range of friction-using devices. In addition to that, other measures could be used as lumbar motion monitor, and as I mentioned previously in limitations, training programs can have extensive variation in the data. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Just a question. When your conclusions change dealing with people that are suffering from health issues, with the rating from 1 to 10 change, and subjects are really struggling or have health problems, and also we tested age range is very young, I guess, probably average age would be around 20. What will happen with your conclusions if you deal with elderly people?
Yes, basically the results that were presented here are the results of the nurses themselves, not the patients. The results for electromyography data and for the subjective ratings, the presentation presented the results for the nurses, how they evaluated themselves, how they found which technique is better than the other technique. That's for the nurses' side. For the patients themselves, some cases as hip surgeries or similar yes.
So the students actually have any issues?
No, the students have passed physical readiness assessment, but this technique could not be applied for critical cases as for hip surgery or in cases where tilting the back might lead to increased possibility of injuries rather than diminution.
I think the sample size is representative, 16 trials. How many times did you try?
Yes. According to the literature, some cited papers and one of the best papers in that domain only used 5 participants, and some studies used only one nurse or one nurse with a lot of dummies of different weights and different friction-using devices. So the approach in selecting the sample size was based on the sample size used in the domain itself.
There was these removing these practices removing patients from. Are they ad hoc, or are they created by the nurses, or are they medical practices that are approved by somebody like the FCU?
When patients finish their operations and they need to be transferred from the operation room to their rooms, they need to be transferred from the OR table to a stretcher, and then from the stretcher to the rooms. So basically, every time the patient needs to be transferred from the OR room to the rooms, and vice versa, nurses need to apply patient.
When they move, do they teach them in the nursing book? This is how you move the patient, or this is ad hoc? They created these techniques.
Theoretically or ideally, nurses shall be trained, but during we spent collecting data in EVMC for around 4 months, a complete semester. But nurses in EVMC at least do not abide by ideal practices or the biomedical required practices.
My question. This is a different thing, right? Is there an ideal practice that is defined in the books, and was that somehow studied?
No, that's what I was trying to tell you.
So there is one. What is that? This is the question. Is there a practice? I mean, how do I move the patient from one bed to the other?
Yes,
It's basically the blanket sheet method. This is
no, it's not the ideal one. It's the most common used one. Transferring the patient using a blanket. so it would act as a control error. But if you're asking for a certain posture, how the legs
He's basically asking, is the plastic bag method invented by the nurses?
Well, all the
Get
methods
away,
that-
or is
The
it
typical medicine practices are well specified, and you have standards, and most of them should be FCC approved. Shit.
slightly more? Sorry. Because of time constraints, I didn't add all friction-reducing devices. Friction-reducing devices are being manufactured by big manufacturers, and there's competition in that. I've only presented 3 of these friction-reducing devices because our target in this research was low-cost friction-reducing devices, but there are a lot of them, and there are different types and more complex ones.
So these are commonly used techniques among nurses. The most common one is just the blanket method. But all of these are approved techniques, and they actually have been proven to be more effective. All right. Thank you, Andrea. The next presenter is Yara Liz. She's coming from the ECE department, and her presentation is titled Context-Dependent Stream Learning Machines.
Hi everyone, thanks for taking the time to attend my presentation. I hope it will be interesting to you guys. I'll try not to go too much into the mathematical details, and it's not very familiar to most of you. So I'll be presenting something called extreme learning machines, which is just the catchy way of one kind of artificial neural networks. Maybe you've already heard about neural networks at some point in various talks today and yesterday. So I'll present a brief overview of what these neural networks are, this special case of neural networks, before presenting my methodology, which is a context-dependent variant that benefits from the data that we are using to train this network. So artificial neural networks in their most basic form are basically a bunch of neurons that are connected using arrows or edges, and then we basically have different weights that we try to learn or discover, if you want, in order to learn a certain function. So we're trying to map our output, or to learn a map between our output and our input. So my output would be y, my input would be x, and I'm trying to discover these values, which are the w's, the v's, and the betas in this case. I assume that I have a single hidden layer, so I have one layer of these connected neurons in the middle. I know what my input is, I know what my output is, so we are dealing in a supervised learning framework. And then I have m of these neurons. So, but one way to train these networks is to assume that we randomly initialize our input weights. So whatever is between my input layer and this hidden layer are called input weights. I say I want to randomly initialize them. When I do that, I effectively plug in values in this nonlinear function, and then I only learn or try to compute these betas, which essentially leads to a convex optimization problem. When I have a convex optimization problem, we can use any of the optimization toolboxes to learn an optimal solution in one step. And this is essentially what we do by first computing this H matrix that depends, that is basically these trees for different inputs. So I have n of these inputs, and then, or training data essentially. And then I compute the beta using a pseudo-inverse, since my H may not necessarily be a square matrix. And I multiply by the output so that I get this mapping that I'm looking for. What we're basically trying to propose in this work is to say, instead of randomly initializing these W's and B's from just a uniform random distribution, let's try to make use of my X's, which are specific to a certain problem, and benefit from this problem's properties to improve our performance when we classify or perform regression, basically, which is really the main focus of this work. So point or the motivation for this project was to exploit the data characteristics instead of using a one-size-fits-all approach. And then we still want to maintain the generalization capabilities of neural networks, but we want to also preserve the fast training of these special kinds of neural networks that are called DLMs, because they can only train in one step, as opposed to, if you're familiar with something called the backpropagation, that usually iterates over the weights to learn their values, and generally takes hundreds, if not thousands, of iterations to converge. So the algorithm in this case is, let's start first with our intuition. So if I have two classes that I'm trying to classify, and we said that we're inputting the way the input is my x's, they're represented by a bunch of features, I'm multiplying them by what is essentially a bunch of random numbers, and then I'm trying to learn a bunch of output weights to predict my output. What we're saying is that instead of randomly initializing, we want to give higher weight to features that are more indicative or provide more information about my output. So if these features give more information, I want to give them higher weight. How do I do that? If we're dealing with a classification problem, and in classification we say we have class 1, class 2, and we have a bunch of features. So for these features, let's say the first 5 of them go between 0 and 1 for class 1, but between 3 and 4 for class 2. Then these 5 features provide a lot of information about these two classes. I want to give these features a high weight. The way that I do that is by essentially taking the difference for the different features across these two different classes. So I take, for all the points in class 1, all the points in class 2, take the difference between all the features, and then just sample from this space of differences to assign the input weights. But this does not exist in regression. Regression is our output is a continuous, has a continuous value, so it's not just two classes, it's not discrete. To map this idea from classification to regression, we say, well, let's cluster them. And by clustering is essentially grouping some of these training samples into smaller groups where they are really very relevant to each other, kind of like classes. But we don't necessarily have two classes. We set the number of clusters to be proportional to the number of hidden layers, hidden neurons that I have. So in this one hidden neuron, one hidden layer, I have m of these neurons. That's how I compute my p. And then I just take the differences between the cluster heads, having them represent kind of the different classes that we just created. So once I do that, I take the differences among the different points in my various clusters. I take the cluster heads, I take their difference, and then that's how I assign my input weights. I use the bias, I use the cardinality of these clusters, so basically the number of points in each cluster, to add a bias to my neuron, and then I simply train using the original methodology, which was compute this H matrix, and then use the pseudo-inverse to get the optimal beta values. So as far as computation complexity of this method, the CDR ELM is what we are proposing. It is definitely more computationally expensive than just randomly assigning values. That is randomly assigning, which would be this row up here, is just proportional to the number of weights that I need to assign values to. But in my case, I'm basically applying a clustering algorithm, which generally is an iterative algorithm and might take some time to converge, and that is really dependent on the type of data that we have. Beyond that, the rest is pretty much the same. The complexity is attributed to computing some matrix multiplications and inversions. So when we consider performance of these algorithms, most of the algorithms are we're comparing to multiple algorithms from the literature. First, we considered about 6 of these benchmark regression data sets from the literature. And I don't know if it's very clear, but I'm basically just normalizing over my mean square error and my training time. And we basically, if we look for the CTR, so for example, for this case, it's not the best performing, but it's not the worst performing either. And maybe this one, it's side with the best performing algorithm. And then when you consider training time, in some cases it's much faster than other algorithms, but it's definitely slower than traditional ELM. And its training time depends on how fast our clustering algorithm converts. So in summary of the regression performance analysis, we can't really say that this algorithm performs better than all other algorithms on all data sets, but that's rarely the case in machine learning. We always have to find the best data that suits this algorithm. So then we considered a steering wheel control problem, and in this case we really need to benefit from the fast convergence of these ELMs, and we noticed that our algorithm converges fairly fast. Faster than ELM, which was not expected, but this is because our data was so well behaved that the clustering algorithm converged very fast. Then as far as testing mean square error, we also got the highest, or the lowest, which is what we're going for. So 10.9 compared to something like 15.5 for the traditional ELM, and 11 maybe for one of the other variants. So we basically did well on this specific problem, which is the steering wheel control problem, and we were usually looking for this kind of problem to target this algorithm. So in conclusion, we were basically able to propose a training algorithm variant for neural networks that can converge or that can be trained fairly fast and that performs well on classification and regression problems. However, we do need to consider the type of data that we're dealing with. So for future work, we would like to characterize the data that is most suitable for this algorithm and reduce its sensitivity to the clustering algorithm from initial conditions to its convergence to really perform better. Thank you for your attention, and I can take questions.
That for different problems, you can learn CR was different. So we're looking at new problems, not problem definition. How can we expect this to work?
So first, we would want to look at how well behaved the data is. So for example, when we cluster it, is it easy to cluster? Are the data points divided into a discrete number of classes well, or is there a lot of overlap between most of the data? You can check that by basically looking at the various ranges of your features. So usually your data, you have many features, and then you have your output. If you compute a correlation between the output and these different features individually, you get different values. If there's a big difference.
Is this what you will typically look at, regardless of what algorithm you should apply? Or
yeah, usually you do.
In specific for your algorithm, what type of data is best suited for? How can you tell?
Yeah, so that's part of the future work, to characterize what kind of data. But so far what we've discovered is the data that can be well clustered, it performs well because it converges faster and it still gets a good training testing accuracy or a low mean square error. Yeah, beyond that, if the data is very noisy, you do not perform very well, stuff like that.
One question that I'm sure it occurred to you also, but I didn't see the comparison. Did you compare against the K-means, which you used as a pre-processing?
The K-means is the pre-processing algorithm that we use, but
Maybe
the K-means does not do
regression.
regression. It does not do regression.
That's the classes, the clusters that you get given
Yeah.
something. Did you see if they are pretty much the class that you want the regression?
The regression is a continuous value. The clusters, they're okay. So you're saying if the values within the same cluster almost had close.
You can see a scale.
Yeah.
Increase the number of classes and see if that maybe it's doing all over.
Yeah. No, we did play around with the number of clusters that we used, essentially mapping back to the number of neurons that we had. And again, that was problem specific. So for some problems, the number of neurons required, I think I had that value in the table. But for example, for some data, we needed about 30 hidden neurons. For others, we needed a bit more. Actually, I don't have them here, but I have them for this specific data set. For this one, we need about 30, compared to something like an ELM that took about 130. But then for the specific clustering part, just stopping at clustering and not doing an ELM and trying to predict the...
If you can break the training time
yeah.
into two parts, how much K means K, and how much did the neural... Okay. And then how much did the neural network contribute to improving the result?
Most of it. So if I stop at clustering and I say, these are my clusters, can I predict my output value, the regression value that I'm trying to find from that?
Okay.
It does not give me a value. I'd have to do a step that would be basically using an average of these values and say that's the prediction thing.
There is a way to compute statistically. So if you have a set of things going to a certain cluster, right, and they're far from the regression value you're taking, so you can use like a logistic regression.
Yeah.
And data. Like a logistic regression.
I didn't do logistic regression. What I did was just average the outputs of these
So
training
do you think
data
the neural
to
network
use
is
it.
doing that one? Or
Yeah, it was doing better than just averaging the values in the cluster.
logistic regression, having a condition.
The logistic regression, well, I don't think it would do better than the ELM. Maybe they'd be comparable and depends on the data, because the ELM finds the optimal value. So you're already solving, so your minimum, you'll find the optimal one. So that would be the best value that you can get for the regression.
So you said well behaved. So what is
Yeah.
does it relate to the inversion of the matrix that we have there? And what if that matrix that we have is not inverted?
It would be ill-conditioned. And then ELM would
How
not
do you
perform
test
very
for that?
well.
Did
We
you
can,
test?
yeah, we
I
can
have
compute.
to test for that. That's very computation expensive, right?
Well, usually with ELM, if you get a very ill-conditioned matrix, the traditional ELM, not my version. So if you just stick to this one, if we get a very ill-conditioned matrix, it will do horribly bad. The reason why my matrix might be ill-conditioned, the data or the weights. I'm randomly assigning weights. I have a high probability, or not high, but an average probability, 50-50 of getting something that's maybe ill-conditioned. If the data is causing this ill-conditioning, it's usually something we can test for in the beginning by just normalizing, doing stuff like that, some pre-processing, and then we can handle that. For the CDR, since we're not completely picking values that are random, and we're actually getting the weights based on the data, because the computing cluster has, the probability of getting something that's very ill-conditioned is less. Now, it still exists, and the way that we solve for that is by just adding a regularization term into my objective functions that I use for randomization.
Thank you, Yaba. Thank you for your questions. We have a coffee break right now. You guys can continue this interesting discussion. And our next presenter will begin at 4:30. Back to the graduate session 2. Our next presenter is from the ECE department. His name is Alex Yan, and he'll be presenting machine learning for network resilience, a second step towards ARS. Thank you.
So, thank you everyone for attending. I'll be presenting my paper titled Machine Learning for Network Resilience, a second step towards ARS, and it's part of my thesis. As an outline, we'll start with the motivations, followed by introduction, and what inspired us to
That's ARS, sorry, forgive my.
Yeah, it will pass. It's AI-based resiliency system. So, as an outline, we'll start with some motivations and an introduction. What inspired us to follow such techniques? A work summary, architectures and designs, a general overview on some preliminary work and results. IT security is spending $101 billion in 2018, with this number expected to increase till $170 billion by 2020, and still the average time between a breach and detection is 205 days, with also 90 million cyber attacks detected annually that cost around $575 billion. And finally, the cost of data breaches is hitting $2.1 trillion globally by 2019. So we can see that money is being spent on security, but still it's not efficient. So maybe it's not been spent wisely, or security alone is not enough. So that is why we are proposing to integrate security with consistency in order to reach a resilient network. So for this purpose, we are proposing the integration of artificial intelligence, which have contributed in many critical areas, and also complex data analysis, with software-defined networking, which allows the decoupling of the control and data planes, and also allow planning the network configuration of the devices in the network. Most of our work, especially the security part, was inspired by our immunity defense system, which implements a double line of defense, with the first line being more general than the second, such that it deflects unfamiliar intruders without the necessity of identifying the type of the attack. And with a second line of defense that works by distributing watchers along the bloodstream in order to specify the type of attack and send alerts. So in general, we are proposing a general solution for network resiliency in terms of security and consistency in a software-based network with remote management, with low processing and overhead. To start, in order to develop an AI-based system, we need new architectures. So that is why we are proposing two general architectures to be implemented in order to enforce both the proposed security and consistency system. We'll start first with the security design. Our investigation will be carried out based on three phases. First, edge feature extraction, followed by feature marking, and finally a multi-layer detection technique. Well, we have seen that the problem in previous work is that every security system that uses AI technique either redirects all traffic to a centralized place in order to be processed, or even redirect packet headers, or mirror traffic, or any of those techniques. This introduced many security issues and many overhead, a lot of overhead on the network. So we are proposing edge feature detection, edge being any relevant node in the network depending on the environment. These edge nodes would extract relevant features from real-time traffic and combine them in a single vector, which is uploaded each time cycle to the controller. The controller will then process these features according to a certain AI technique in order to come out with the decision. Followed by feature extraction is feature marking. So this edge node will include a signature inside the vector, so that we are able to include this signature in the training and testing process, so that we can study the global network flow in order to more efficiently detect distributed type of attacks and also related sequence of events that may lead to an attack. And finally, we will be implementing a general anomaly detection layer, followed by a more specific attack identification layer. And overall, hopefully, reach a fast detection system that will detect known and unknown attack that will detect known and unknown attacks in real time with slow processing, keeping into hand robustness and scalability. Similar to the security system is the consistency design, with parameter extraction, parameter marking, and also the consistency and verification technique. We would argue that there's no security without consistency, because maintaining a consistent network is knowing what the network is really doing, and also creating a solid foundation for our security design. So in our case, consistency is ensuring that our security measures should not impact the general functionality of the network, and also consistency should be verified in terms of security measures, modules, policies, and updates. Overall, we would have something like this: a security solution interacting with a consistency solution in order to reach a resilient network. So, in order to reach such a system, we are proposing also two architectures. The first architecture being the DC squared architecture, which is DCC, with distributed edge feature extraction, a centralized processing LD controller, which would process the uploaded vector from the edge nodes, and also a centralized decision-making and management of LD controller level. While the second architecture is a D2C architecture with also distributed edge feature extraction, but this time also a distributed processing using an AI-based overlay network on the data plane, where each node will play a role of a single or multiple neuron, let's say, of the AI network. So, but we will still have a centralized controller that optimizes the process and the decision making. To elaborate more on that, we would see a DC squared architecture. So here the controller, the centralized controller, will choose the edge nodes, and as a packet would reach the edge node, features would be extracted. These features would be combined in a single vector. The vector will be uploaded to the controller each time cycle.
The edge node is
the switch.
entry point into the network.
Maybe it depends on the environment. If we are
to this node,
it's the entry point.
okay.
If we are protecting the network from the outside attacks, okay, the entry point. Maybe we have sometimes we need to protect the network from inside attacks also. So we need a fixed point that many, okay, all this data is passing through. So this vector will reach the controller each time cycle. The time cycle will depend on the environment. So, and this vector that contains the features will be processed within the AI technique for decision making. So this is for the first architecture. The second architecture, we have the D2C. Let's say we have a simple neural network, 3 layers, input, hidden, output layer, with a total of 6 neurons. Okay? We want to overlay such a network, such a neural network over the nodes. So it works like this. Okay, the features will enter the input node, be processed, data will reach the hidden layers. Okay, another processing, data will reach the output layer. We will have a decision. So if we want to overlay such a network over the network, let's say the controller will choose which nodes inside the network to contribute in this processing node. It doesn't have to choose 6 nodes. A single switch or a single node or single device in the network can work or do the job of multiple neurons. In this case, the controller chose 5 neurons, 5 devices to act as for the 6 neurons. And we can see here shade just to represent that this node is doing the job of multiple neurons, of 2 neurons. So the controller will optimize the process, packets will reach the edge nodes, and in the same time, these will play at the input nodes. They will do the processing of the input nodes. Data will be sent to the hidden layer. If a direct path is not found, the controller will choose a path. These 2 nodes will do the job of the hidden layer. Then data will be sent to the output layer. for decision making. The output would be sent to the controller for global decision making, and also we are currently working on something like a sample of local decision making before a global decision making can be done. So, as a general overview, we are proposing two architectures. This is where C to be used to enforce the security and consistency system in order to reach ARS, which is an AI-based network resiliency system. So since AI is the engine of our work, I will show some preliminary work on the AI algorithms. We use the NSLKD dataset, which is a benchmarking dataset containing around 150,000 records. Classified in 5 classes: denial of service, user to root, remote to local, anti-probing, and normal traffic. That set is distributed between training and testing samples. And here are some examples of types of attack that would come under these types of classes. And at the end, till now we have tested multiple AI techniques between anomaly detection and attack identification on balanced and unbalanced data. And we can see that random forest till now gave us the higher result. And the next best results are given by neural networks, which is backpropagation neural network and deep neural network. Okay, and for this, I thank you.
Right, thank you, Ali. Any questions for Ali?
I saw that one of the nodes played the role of a hidden layer node and an output node.
Yeah.
Is it possible?
It will decrease the message interaction between two nodes. So this hidden layer, after it gets an output, the output will stay at the same node and will cross on the output layer.
Are you training? You train? It's supervised learning?
Yes.
General neural networks work if the environment is operated. We have data that makes sense. Okay? And here what we have is an adversary, an attacker, trying to breach. He looks at the system, understands where are the weaknesses of the system, and attacks. So you have a non-cooperating environment. Yeah. What is the intuition? I don't think I know this. What is the intuition of using something that works with the cooperating environment to detect an adversary, which is, it seems counterintuitive to me. So
I think the best answer here is if we can get the best features to be used to teach, to learn, to train this type of network, we can detect multiple attacks. That is why the proposed architecture and the proposed designs are not necessarily fixed to a certain type of AI-based system. Because, okay, the overlay network is best done when using neural networks. But the centralized one can be an ensemble of any two AI systems. So different AI systems would detect different attacks. We can't say that a single system can detect every known attack and unknown attack there is. That is why the proposed architectures are irrelevant of the use systems.
Okay. Thank you, Ali. We're going to have to move to the next presenter. Round of applause. The next presenter is for Industrial Engineering and Management, Dana Zook, and her presentation is titled Emergence and Generation-Wide Workforce in Lebanon, Motivation Factors in the Work Environment.
name is Dana Subah, and today I'm going to be sharing with you my presentation on the emergence of Generation Y workforce in Lebanon, what motivates them, and how we can better shape the work environment to fit them. So I'm going to be sharing with you who is Generation Y exactly. We're going to go into the research we did to understand how we got what motivates them, and then I'm going to share with you the conclusions that we've got. Does any of you recognize this one here? Does anyone recognize this?
Yeah.
Exactly. If you recognize any of these things on my slide, then you probably belong to Generation Y workforce, and you were probably been born between the year 1980 and 1999. Am I right? 1980, 1999, anyone?
1999.
I still have a certificate, by the way. I still have that.
Well, if you had these, aside from being born from the year 1980 to 1999, you've also had an awesome childhood. Let's get that clear, okay? So who is Generation Y? Let me start by telling you what a generation is. A generation is basically a group of people who belong to the same age group. They have similar experiences, history, and the environment in general. So the Generation Y, as I said, they're the one between 1980 and 1999. Now, what's worth noting is that by the year 2020, so 2 years from now, 50% of the workforce are going to be Generation Y. So yeah, that's coming up. And each generation has its own characteristics. So Generation Y, according to the literature review, are known to come from high educational background. So most of them went to universities. They seek learning and professional development. They prefer working in teams. They are very good at focusing on several things. And it's worth noting that they're the first generation to have technology available at affordable prices. And last but not least, they really like having this work-life balance. Generation Y at the moment, they're between the age of 18 and 38. And according to studies done in Lebanon, they're actually the highest concentrated group in the demographic. So we know, okay, so we have Generation Y, we know they're entering the workforce. What's the problem? The issue we have is that the workforce is not ready for them. We don't know what motivates them. We don't know how to recruit and retain them in the field. So how can we solve this? And if you ask me why we're targeting motivation, that's because studies have shown that motivation affects performance, and performance has an effect on whether a project's going to fail or succeed. And that's why we went for motivation. Now, there have been a lot of theories related to motivation. I'm pretty sure everyone is familiar with Abraham Maslow's theory of needs. And there have been derived theories of it in the past, but in this study, we're only going to focus on 28,000 5 motivational dimensions because it's the only theory that targets his work preferences. 28,000 motivational theory of needs basically says that motivation can be segmented into 5 dimensions. So we have 5 dimensions: extrinsic, intrinsic, altruistic, leisure, and social. And each dimension has motivation factors under it. So extrinsic dimension is the one that's related to things primary in the job. You have the salary, the status, the position, the reputation of the company. Intrinsic dimension has factors that are related to things innate in the job. So am I learning? Is it interesting? Does it challenge me? The altruistic is things that is the dimension related to giving back to the community. Leisure, wanting to have an easy-based job, you want to have a lot of vacations. Social is the dimension related to having relationships in the workplace. So you want to make friends there. Now, what we did in our research, how we wanted to understand what motivates Generation Y in Lebanon, we did 2 kinds. The quantitative, where we did a survey, and the qualitative, where we conducted interviews with mostly managers just to understand their perspective about Generation Y employees that they have. So how did we get our own motivation factors? We derived factors from all the previous theories that were related to motivation, and then we segmented them into the 5 dimensions, and we ended up with 25 things that motivates us in the workplace. And participants in the survey really just had to fill if this factor, do they feel that it's not at all important, doesn't matter to me, or it's absolutely essential, I need to have it in my job to be motivated. For the survey, for the interviews, we just asked, we talked with professionals, and we wanted to, these questions were centered around what motivates you at work, and then since they have employees, they were centered, how are you motivating your own employees, and what are the strategies that you're doing? For this profile, so who were we interviewing, who was filling the surveys? They just had to be millennials, and the difference between interviews and surveys, interviews just had to have experience in managerial positions. So the interesting part, what are the results that we got? How are we being motivated? if we're taking factors on their own, and after 290 surveys that were accepted, the highest factor that we've got is promotion opportunities. So the number one thing we want is promotion opportunities, where 50% of survey participants ranked that it's absolutely essential. And we have a couple more that rank the highest, which are learning new things and feeling that the work we do adds value and whatnot. Now, what's worth noting is that 6 out of the 10 that we've got were related to the intrinsic dimension, which was the dimension where we want to learn new things. Now, those are the factors on their own. But if we want to understand the dimension as a whole, we got more studies into the mean and the standard deviation, and it showed the intrinsic one had not only the highest mean, but the lowest standard deviation, meaning people who filled the survey were in agreement on the mean. We also conducted t-tests to see, for example, if gender, age range, and level of education affects our preferences towards dimensions and factors. So, for example, maybe an undergrad would feel differently than someone with a master's degree about what motivates them. But actually, in fact, there was no significance except in gender, where females shown to have more, where it felt that they wanted to give back to the community more, so that factor was present more, and they want, as a dimension, they wanted to go for altruistic. There have been other studies similar done in other countries such as UAE, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and the US, and you can tell that each country, the Generation Y are all over the globe, but each country has their own preferences. This could be contributed to political, socio-economical, culture, anything. Now, if there's one thing you want to take from this presentation, is that if you want to motivate as managers or employers, if you want to motivate your employees for a short period of time, you can focus on factors on their own. And as previously mentioned, promotion opportunities is the highest thing Generation Y seeks in Lebanon, and then there are other factors you can focus on. But if you want to make sure they're motivated on the long term, and you want to make sure that your product and the performance is high, you can focus on the intrinsic factor because it ranks the most, and that is wanting to learn new things and seeing the work we're doing adding value and whatnot. Now, the best part about these interviews that I've got to talk with professionals is seeing how they perceive their employees. And one thing that stood out was an advice towards how to engage your Generation Y employees was to find out what is it that thing that they enjoy learning and manage to incorporate that in their jobs. So I'm not saying just change their task completely and then have them. You just have to incorporate their learning with their roles and the job. And yeah, that's basically it. I'd just like to take this moment to thank everyone who filled the survey and did the interviews, and to my advisor. And I hope the upcoming Generation Y are very motivated in the workplace. Thank you.
More for questions? What's your major?
I'm doing my master's in engineering management, and I have a background in industrial engineering. And I like this management side because I like to, you can be technical and everything, but if you don't have this behavioral side, technical is not going to matter a lot. You have to complement both.
Can you go back to the slide where you have the question and categorize the answers? Yeah.
This one?
Yeah. What is the difference between see the results of what you do and feel the work you do and its value? Is there a difference between these two dimensions?
Yeah, actually, and we've also, I used SPSS, and it showed that there have been differences in each question.
The meaning of these two sentences, if I read them, for me,
sometimes you feel like you're adding value to something, but sometimes managers, you don't see what the work you're doing is going somewhere. So you do all this work, but where is it going? So it's so that factor is related that you want to see the results.
If I may and assume these two are equal, I would say their score will be additive, or what happens?
No, so I would just have one factor that combines both.
And what's an average? So what would be the score? Would it rank above promotion opportunities?
If you're combining both, then they're just going to be rating one factor. I don't think it's going to matter.
So I'm assuming they are dependent and not independent as you see here. What would be 45.5 or 2.8? How would I take them to another? Can I benefit from this data, or do I need to measure again?
I think you need to measure again because they're actually different.
Any other questions?
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
What's the relationship between Generation Y and your survey? Is it directed towards that generation? Or
Actually, the survey can be applied to other generations to study if they have, like for example, if you want to compare two generations, you could have the same surveys, but it would give different results. There have been actually literature review that compared different generations, but for my study, I only stuck to generation Y because 2020 is coming up. So.
Even the 290 surveys were targeting.
Yeah, they had to fill a survey, and that category where they had to fill in their age group was mandatory to make sure that the result is valid.
I think it would be really interesting to see what other generations, how would they respond, and then we can then have a profile of how different generations are responding.
Yeah, definitely. It could be done for future studies. But there have been similar studies in the past where they did get to away the generation. But for my study, I stuck to generation Y. But coming up, the generation Z is coming up, so you can worry about those because they're going to be entering the workforce later. X, Y, and Z. Yeah. هلا اني بعمل بالمدرسة.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you.
The next presenter is Fatima Zahra Asadullah, and the title of her presentation is the Compact Multi-Band PIFA for Mobile Devices for the ECE department.
I am Fatima Sadallah. I'm a PhD student, and actually my major is on radio frequency and electromagnetics. Actually, the paper that I've submitted to this conference, the title of the paper is a compact PIFA, a multi-band PIFA for mobile phones. But in this talk, I like to go further in some additional details in my dissertation. So, as an outline, I'll be talking about the motivation of this work and the objective, the multi-band PIFA design that I've done, the reconfigurable antenna design that I've built, and how I was inspired from the antenna design to do a filter, a band reject reconfigurable filter design, and the MIMO implementation of the overall system. So, starting with the motivation, actually, if we really open a mobile phone, we see that there is at least 5 antennas in a mobile phone. So the question is, why not having all these 5 antennas to be replaced by just single one antenna? But this antenna should operate at the wireless communication frequencies. So first, we'll have a multi-band antenna design. And this multi-band antenna design needs to be compact in order to have a compact mobile devices. Well, another question is, okay, we are combining these 5 antennas to a single antenna that operates at all the wireless communication frequencies. But we know that we are not always using these applications all the time. So what we can do is to build a reconfigurable antenna that changes its frequency on demand. And we need switches in order to do this. So reconfiguration will give multiple applications. And this is suitable for modern technologies. So there is a need for miniaturized reconfigurable antennas. So if I want to summarize my objective, is first to build a miniaturized reconfigurable antenna. However, I need this antenna to be operational at all the wireless communication frequencies for mobile phones. And by wireless communication frequencies, I mean 2G, 3G, GSM, GPS, Wi-Fi. Okay? And since I'm using reconfiguration, then I'm going to use switches. So extended analysis was done on the effect of switches on the antenna performance. So starting with a multi-band PIFA design, so if one go into the details of the design of this antenna is called a printed inverted F antenna that was first designed such that its length, its width, and the sorting sheet width is equivalent to lambda over 4 of the operational frequency. And here I chose my sorting frequency to be 1.54 gigahertz, corresponding to the GPS application. And after that, inside the design, I've added these slots. So here I have around 6 slots where their length is equivalent to lambda over 2 of the desired frequencies. And these frequencies, for example, we have the 770 megahertz corresponding to LTE, the 900 and the 900 meg and 1.8 gig corresponding to the GSM, the 2.1 for 3G and 2.4 for Wi-Fi. So, this antenna was based on 1.54 gigahertz, and here we have the reflection coefficient plot. And for mobile phone, when we have the reflection coefficient to be less than minus 6 dB, then we have operation of the antenna at this frequency. So here we started our antenna to be, it's just the BIFA antenna with no slots, to be operational at 1.54 gigahertz. And after that, we added the longest slot that is equivalent to 770 megahertz of operation. And by adding the additional one, we'll have the operation at 900 megahertz. After that, by adding all the slots, we'll have the operation at all the required wireless communication frequencies. And by this plot, we can see the simulation and the measurement results of my antenna. So the simulated antenna and the prototype that was built. So now we have this multi-band BIFA design. But if we have a look on this multi-band BIFA design, you can see that we have like approximately 6 slots. We have actually 6 slots in this design. So the question was, since we have all these slots, why not reducing all these slots to a single slot, where this slot length changes by resorting to only 2-pin diodes. So here we use only 2-pin diodes to get all these 7 frequencies. And the number of switches used is a major issue for radiation, for if we are working with antennas, and if we are working for filters, then the transmission coefficient will have a lot of losses and nonlinearity. So we'll talk about this later on. So what we've done here, we have all these six slots, and we have a total dimension of the antenna to be 37 by 26.5 millimeters squared. So first, the dimension of the antenna is reduced to be 15 by 25 millimeters squared only. And this antenna operates at 1.8 gigahertz at GSM. And after that, we inserted this single slot with these 2-pin diodes. And the length, the electrical length of this antenna varies with the variation of the configuration of the switches. So for example, if we have a look on this reflection coefficient plot, so if we have like S1 is off and S2 is on, so the first switch is off, and we have operation of the second switch, we'll have a resonance at 1.54 gigahertz direct curve for GPS. However, if we have a look on the blue curve where S1 is off and S2 is also off, we'll have operation at 2.4 gigahertz corresponding to the Wi-Fi application. And by this reconfigurable antenna, we can achieve all these frequencies and all these applications that are the LTE, GSM on the 2 frequencies, GPS, 3G, and Wi-Fi. Also Wi-Fi at 2.4 gigahertz and 5.2 gigahertz.
How can you have 2 switches and achieve 5?
Thank you for your question. Can I answer it at the end? Thank you. Okay. Yeah. So, after that, we thought about, okay, we have this slot. And we have this slot on the radiating antenna. Why not placing this slot in the ground plane and transforming it from an antenna to a filter? And this filter operates as a band reject filter on these frequencies. And the reason behind this is because, okay, we have built this reconfigurable antenna. It is compact. It does operate at all the wireless communication frequencies. However, we know inside the antenna, we need a MIMO system. Multiple input, multiple output. Okay? So, if you want to place these 2 antennas in close proximity, this will give a lot of coupling or anti and low isolation between these 2 antennas. So, in order to solve this, we thought about having this filter. And this filter is made up from the same slot of the radiating antenna. And this filter will reduce the coupling between these two antennae and thus increase the isolation. Okay, so what have we done is that we took this slot. This is the same slot that we've used for the radiating port, and we placed in the ground plane. And we have here the safety on transmission line. So, if you want to think about what's happening with the current distribution, how we are getting these results, how this slot has transformed to a filter when placed in the ground plane, you can have a look on this demonstration. And we have here the current path inside the slot. So we'll have here at this point, we'll have path 1, and another path 2, and the reflection part, that is path 3. This is what's happening with the waves transmitting inside the slot. And each path can be represented by second order LC circuit with these values. And here you can see the comparison between the transmission and the reflection coefficient of the slot design, of the filter design, with the LC circuit. And you can see the matching between the results, where here we can prove that we have a filter, and this filter is a band reject reconfigurable filter that rejects all these frequencies, 7 frequencies, using only 2 switches. So now we can build our MIMO system. We have this MIMO system. We have here, we have this diodes with 2 switches. We have 2 antennas with a filter that's separating these 2 antennas. This prototype is a MIMO system with high isolation between the 2 antennas, and each antenna can radiate at the various communication frequencies, and it is reconfigurable. And we have here a separation between the antenna of only 29 millimeters between them. So this MIMO system can be integrated in a mobile device. So, as we said earlier, that we have switches when we are working with reconfiguration. What type of switches I am using, and which one is better, and why? So what I've done here is I've chosen diodes, RF MEMS, and varactors. And all these switches are analog switches. And a comparison was conducted where we had these results. If you want to have a look on the number of switches per radiating element, you can see that for varactors, for example, you only need 1 switch to operate at all these frequencies, and I'm going to explain why later. And whereas for diodes or RF MEMS, we need 2 or 2. For the DC input power, the varactor will need 250 milliwatt power in order to operate or to change its capacitance value and thus change its configuration. Whereas for diodes, only 10 milliwatts are required. Whereas the radiation efficiency of the antenna, is between 99 and 79% when you are using varactor inside this radiating antenna. However, it drops down to 44 or 14, between 44 and 14 when we are using diodes. So if you want to think about it, so which switch I should use? So it's really depending on the application. For example, if I want to place this antenna inside a mobile device, and I know that communication over high distances is required for communication or for mobile devices. So radiation efficiency is a major issue for antenna designers. So varactors is the solution here. However, if I wanted to place my antenna, let's say, in an IoT device, Internet of Things device, where distance is not a major issue, however, power consumption is an issue. So here, diodes are the solution. Okay? So as a conclusion, reconfigurable antennas are needed for mobile devices. Miniaturized antennas are a necessity. A designer must carefully choose a reconfigurable component, and there is always a trade-off between power consumption, efficiency, among other things. And currently I'm working with digital components, digital switches, so digital tuning is the next step in the future. Before I end, I would like to thank my professor, Dr. Joseph Constantine, and thank you all for being here today. So I would like to answer your question. So
actually, it's a good thing that you acknowledge your advisor.
Yeah, of course, he's my advisor.
Advisor acknowledges.
Thank you. Okay, so Ben is Jerry.
Yeah,
Okay.
go ahead.
So the idea is that if we have, there is like a formula that says that if we have n switches, then the minimum number of frequency is 2 power n. يعني مثلا, let's say you know, I want to design an antenna that has 3 frequency of operation, and it's a reconfigurable antenna. So 3 is on, yeah, I can stick to only 2 switches. The fact that 3 switches, then there is redundancy in my design. والمشكلة هون إنه نحن we have non-linearity issue when dealing with switches. So this non-redundancy is not accepted.
The other way. If you have one switch,
then I can reach only 2 frequencies.
So you can reach or not reach it. You can represent 2 things with 1 bit.
Of course.
With 2 bits, you can represent 4 things.
Exactly.
You said you have 2 pin diodes, switches, and their
Okay.
state is on off, so you can represent 4 things. So where does
Yeah, but here we have a reconfigurable and a multi-band antenna. يعني على كل configuration it is a multi-band on different frequencies.
So I have 5 frequencies. I want to select the first one. I have off off.
Yeah.
Off on. I select the second. On off. I select the third one. On I select the fourth one. What do I do to select the fifth one?
Exactly. So.
Also that one.
هون اللعبة. Yeah, because here, like, if you want to go back to the first antenna design, that was the multi-band one. So if you have a look here on the multi-band design, in multi-band design, we have no switches, and we are able to reach these frequencies, right? So there is a multi-band antenna. We transform this antenna to a reconfigurable one using only one slot. However, this slot operates as a multi-band antenna at each configuration. So if we want to have a look on the results, we have here the 900 megahertz. If we look on the red curve, we have here the 900 megahertz for the like إذا نطلع بس على red curve, we have 900 megahertz, 1.54, 1.8, 2.6.
So what's the value of switching the state? So it's
We are
the modulation length, right?
The electrical length of the slot.
So why would I switch from one state to the other?
Because I'm not able to reach all these frequencies. I'm not able to reach all these frequencies. I'm able to reach like 2 out of 5. So I'm using the switch to figure out the transition. Let's say مثلا عندنا 1.54 جيجا هرتز بس ما عندنا 2.1.
So each state has more than one frequency operating. So it's not one frequency per state.
Exactly.
So and then if I want to select the frequency to operate on,
it will be based on the RF end. Then it will be on the RF end part, like this filter will.
The filter to actually operate.
It is present. It is present. It will be present anyway. For a multi-band antenna.
The answer to this question is that there is another selector on the filter, and you will select one or the other.
Of course.
The frequency from it.
Of course. For the RF.
Look like magic.
I didn't get.
Not only the filter, by the way.
You will have a full reconfigurable front end. So the output, like reaching the baseband, it will be just the frequency that you want.
So the other question is, which should be something very interesting. Can I operate on multiple frequencies if I have more than one? I want to get 2 signals at once, 3 signals at once.
Actually, this is the purpose of this reconfiguration. Now we're talking not about that antenna.
My phone, but
we can do it. Yeah, of course. It depends on the RF front end. If this RF front end is all parts are capable of doing this or not. So this is the question here, not on the antenna part. So the antenna part is capable of doing that, but out the other parts. So if I want my design to be operational instantaneously, I can do it. I need to check all the parts of the RF front end.
So I can have a video conference, answer a phone call, supposedly maybe Robert is talking, and at the same time download the file.
Yeah, you can do this.
And using 3 frequencies at the same time, using one of these states.
Yeah, you can just use a full duplex RF front end that operates on all these frequencies, and each one will be connected to its own baseband, so there's no problem with that.
So another question, which relates to you were in the seminar for Management. Is this ad hoc work or
Yeah.
how did you determine these lengths? Did you just relate?
No. There is a hard, strong background behind every single step we moved forward.
How do you select these lengths?
So actually, if you want to go to the first part of the multi-band design, like so let's start from the initial steps of my design. So first, in theory, to build a printed inverted F antenna, we have the formula that says that the length, the width of the antenna subtracting the sorting sheet should be equivalent to lambda over 4 of the operation frequency. And this is where I chose my frequency to be 1.54 gigahertz in order to have a compact design. So here we have a design of 3.7.
You did this, but you could have selected another operational point that would work.
Yes.
Why did you select this number?
Because I have these limitations or criteria that I want my design to be compact. Okay, I want to replace all these 5 antennas by a single one, but I don't want this antenna to be a big antenna. I want it to be...
This is the optimum. Can I go lower than this? Well, that is worth and I'm satisfied with it.
No, it is... Okay, this work took a year, even a year and a half to do it.
Of trying?
It's not of trying. It's actually of having this antenna. After that, adding these slots. After that, you have this coupling factor. It is a major factor when dealing with several slots on an antenna.
There's no formula where I have you didn't optimize.
No, there's no optimization, but there is a starting point, and it's very essential. Thank you.
So this is published?
Yes. Yeah. In the AWPR paper.
All right, Blake and Fatima, thank you all for coming. That wraps this session.
Tonight we're going to be reading the winners of several awards. And I'd like to say before we do that all of you deserve an award for making this event so energetic, so exciting, and so stimulating. So, give yourself a hand. Are any of you about to graduate by chance? You're planning? Just 3 or 4? 5? 7? Okay, we'll let 7 of you graduate. So, how many of you are about to graduate? Seriously. Professors, can you put your hands down? So this is kind of a warm-up for graduation also. We're going to be doing some festivities around then, which will be coming up soon. How many of you thought the Maker Faire was a good addition to the conference this year? Did you guys like the Maker Faire? What is it? Okay. All right. I do want to thank one person in particular. I've thanked a lot of people during this conference, but I want to thank in particular Mazen Safiya, Professor. He chaired the committee. It was a big committee actually, had many people on it. He chaired the committee and he saw through this vision for a totally new platform. I want those of you who are going to be here next year who didn't graduate to kind of remember how we did this year and to think also what other modules you might want to add. What other things might we want to do? I want to do kind of like an egg drop competition from the roof of this building. I'd like to do a bicycle race maybe. You can dream up whatever modules, whatever events you'd like to attach to this basic platform that we call Ideas. It'll be Ideas 2019. So this is an early invitation to Ideas 2019. Since we were so late in inviting you this year to 2018, we can't say you weren't invited. All right, from the looks on your faces, you really don't want to hear from me anymore. You want to hear who won the awards. So I'm going to turn over the microphone to Associate Dean Ahmed Maisi, who's going to be reading the names, and I'm going to have some assistants up here in handing out the awards, and I'll see you at the back end of these awards. I'm also lucky to have on the stage here Associate Dean Salah Sadeh and Assistant Dean Okay, we have Maya Abuzaid up here too.
Okay, we will start with the Dean's Award for Creative Achievement. The program in architecture, the award goes to Rasha Duhman. Chemical and Petroleum Engineering, the award goes to Basim Abu Diab, General goes to Hussein Abdullah.
got في ميوت شيل الميوت على الثاني. فينا نصوركم بليز؟ لا ضرب بالنص
These awards for great achievement for computer and communications engineering goes to Morgan Aili, Hani Ghassas, Rashid Awfa. The award goes to John Paul. The award goes to Sarah Sarufi.
كل شوي عم بروح لهونيك.
Industrial Engineering and Management. Great Achievement Award goes to Joy Ostaiger. Last but not least, for the King's Award for Great Achievement, Mechanical Engineering, the award goes to Reem Aidani.
It's okay, خلاص, it's okay.
Okay, next award is Best Undergraduate Research Presentation Award. And the project or the paper that won the award is Sketch to Code by the students Dana Abu Ali and Zaka Saifullah.
Coffee and milk, please. Sorry.
For Best Graduate Research Presentation Award, the award goes to the paper, The Compact Multiband FIFA for Mobile Devices. Best Graduate Research Poster Award goes to the students from the Biomedical Engineering Program, Hisham Ahmad, Diana Al-Hajj, and Abdah Malak. Are they here? And now, for Best Student Society Award, the Best Student Society Award goes to the Lebanese Aerospace and Automotive Engineering. The People's Choice Award. The People's Choice Award for the Link Repair goes to the Mechanical Engineering Group, Muhammad Shamsuddin, Sayyid Azime, Yasir Makki, and Hadi Ali.
شخصين please.
Now we have the awards from the Civil Engineering, Civil and Environmental Engineering Department for best papers during the FYP presentation. In second place, we have two winning teams. The first one is for the project Ramli 2.0 by the students from Ahmed Khan, Aziz Hamad, Kara Saira, Jaksa, and Ziyad Yassin.
شخصين هون شخصين هون
the CE FYP Best Paper Award. The project, Secondary Highway between Mecca and Beirut, by the students Bilal Abu Ghali, Yunus Abu and Gita Technology. Rehabilitation of Shubakno House. We also have the Wholesome Awards.
Just a quick word on the Wholesome Award. It is not necessarily part of the conference, but because it relates to it, there will be a special announcement for that, or a celebration for this with the Wholesome people. But we thought today, because most of you are here, we will also announce the Wholesome just for announcement. You come in, but no awards for now. The award is for you. So I found that we will announce the groups today. I found our Wholesome representative. Alright, so 3 awards for third place. Group number 13. So they know themselves. Their project is Net Zero Building Design.
Dr. Asim.
Second place for the Wholesome Award. Group number 4. So they know themselves, the organic, internet design, something like that. Advisor for this is Dr. Isam Sugur and Dr. Waisa, this is Dr. Farouk Hamdi and Dr. Waisa Tabak. And finally, the winners of the Wholesome Award for the Best FYP in Civil and Environmental Engineering 2018 goes to project number 14 in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and their project is on low-cost construction housing. Are they here? The advisors, Dr. Isam Sugur, but to make it clear, Dr. Isam Sur and Dr. Isam Abari. But again, this is anonymous and it is chosen by Hudson. Isam is not involved in the selection, just to make sure. Seriously, he goes anonymously to Hudson, make sure that anonymously.
Marcelo!